1. You cannot ask to become a member. You must be chosen. The most fundamental misunderstanding outsiders held about Cosa Nostra for the better part of a century was that it operated like a gang, that men joined because they wanted to, that ambition and violence were sufficient qualifications. The reality, as described consistently across the testimony of every significant cooperating witness from Valachi in 1963 to Gravano in 1991, was the opposite. Cosa Nostra selected its members. The process was closer to recruitment than application, and the candidate had no formal role in initiating it. A made member, typically a soldier or a capo, would identify an associate who had demonstrated reliability, earning capacity, and the willingness to commit acts of violence on behalf of the organization without hesitation or complication. That member would then propose the candidate to his capo, who would in turn raise the name with the family's administration. The name would be circulated among all 5 families through the commission. This was not a formality. If any family had an objection, a personal grievance, an unresolved debt, or intelligence that the candidate had cooperated with law enforcement at any point in his life, the candidacy was dead. The process could take months. In some cases, it took years. Associates who lobbied visibly for membership were not rewarded for their enthusiasm. They were noted as men who did not understand how the organization worked. That observation alone could disqualify them permanently. 2. The initiation ceremony followed a script that did not change for over a century. Joseph Valachi described the ceremony in 1963. Tommaso Buscetta described it in 1984. Sammy Gravano described it in 1991. The details across 3 decades and 2 continents were functionally identical. The candidate was brought to a room where members of the family were seated around a table. A saint card, typically depicting the family's patron saint, was placed in his cupped hands and set alight. As the paper burned, the candidate repeated an oath in Sicilian or Italian, swearing loyalty to the family above all other allegiances, including blood family, and accepting that he entered alive and would leave only dead. Blood was drawn from the trigger finger, typically by a pinprick. The burning of the saint card symbolized the destruction of the old self. The blood formalized the bond. The candidate was then told that he was now a friend of ours. That phrase had operational significance. It was not a greeting. It was an identification code used between members to confirm one another's status. The ceremony varied in no meaningful way across families or decades. Buscetta, testifying before Italian magistrate Giovanni Falcone about Sicilian Cosa Nostra, described procedures identical to those Gravano described in a Brooklyn federal courtroom 7 years later. The organization had maintained ritual continuity across an ocean for the better part of a century. 3. A made man could never raise his hand to another made man without authorization. Violence within Cosa Nostra was not prohibited. It was regulated. The distinction was critical and was enforced with absolute consistency. Any act of physical violence against a made member of any family, from a fist thrown in a bar to a bullet fired in an alley, required prior authorization from the administration of both the aggressor's family and the victim's family. This was not a suggestion. It was the rule that more than any other held the structure together. Without it, the 5 families would have collapsed into a permanent internal war within a single generation. The authorization process was hierarchical. A soldier who had a grievance with another soldier brought the matter to his capo. The capo brought it to the underboss or the boss. If the target belonged to another family, the request was communicated through the commission. At each level, the merits were evaluated. Was the grievance legitimate? Would the proposed action create complications? Would it draw law enforcement attention? Was the target a significant earner whose removal would cost the organization money? Only after all levels had approved could the action proceed. The consequence for unauthorized violence against a made man was death, not always immediately, not always publicly, but inevitably. Joseph Valachi testified that this single rule was impressed upon him more forcefully than any other at his induction. It was the first thing he was told after the ceremony. The organization could survive almost any external threat. It could not survive members killing each other without permission. 4. You could never involve another member's wife or family in any dispute. The separation between criminal operations and domestic life was not a courtesy within Cosa Nostra. It was codified practice. A member's wife, children, and immediate family were considered untouchable under all circumstances, regardless of what the member himself had done. If a soldier had stolen from the family, cooperated with federal agents, or committed an act warranting execution, the response was directed exclusively at him. His family was not to be threatened, harmed, surveilled for the purpose of intimidation, or used as leverage. This rule served a practical function that extended well beyond morality. If families believed their wives and children could be targeted, the incentive to cooperate with law enforcement increased dramatically. A man facing a 20-year sentence might remain silent if he believed his family was safe. The same man, told his wife might be at risk, had every reason to seek federal protection for all of them and testify in exchange. The rule also maintained internal cohesion. Made men lived in communities where their families socialized together. Wives knew each other. Children attended attended the same schools. Targeting a family member would have destroyed the social fabric that made the organization's residential concentration possible. Violations of this rule were among the most seriously punished offenses in the organization's internal code. Salvatore Rina's decision to order the killing of relatives and associates of informants in Sicily during the 1980s and early 1990s was considered by many within the organization itself as a transgression that ultimately weakened the structure he claimed to be protecting. 5. A member was forbidden from dealing in narcotics. The rule was real, the enforcement was not. Of all the rules within Cosa Nostra, none generated more internal contradiction than the prohibition on narcotics trafficking. The rule was stated clearly and consistently. Made members were not to involve themselves in the drug trade. The reasoning, as articulated by bosses from Carlo Gambino to Paul Castellano, was strategic rather than moral. Drug operations attracted an intensity of federal law enforcement attention that endangered the entire organization. A gambling operation that was exposed might result in fines and short sentences. A heroin operation that was exposed brought mandatory minimums, RICO enhancements, and the kind of pressure that turned men into informants. The rule was real, it existed, it was communicated to every new member, and it was broken so routinely and so broadly that its primary function became political rather than operational. Bosses used it selectively to punish members who had become inconvenient for other reasons. A soldier dealing narcotics with the quiet approval of his capo might operate for years without consequence. The moment that soldier became a problem, the narcotics violation provided a ready justification for his removal. The Pizza Connection case, which ran from 1975 to 1984, demonstrated the scale of the contradiction. The Bonanno family and its Sicilian affiliates ran a heroin distribution network through pizza parlors that moved an estimated $1.65 billion in product over 9 years. The operation was not a rogue crew acting without knowledge. It was an organizational enterprise that required logistical coordination at the highest levels. The rule against narcotics was Cosa Nostra's most visible piece of institutional hypocrisy. It survived because it was useful, not because it was observed. 6. Every earner paid tribute upward. The percentage was fixed and non-negotiable. The financial architecture of Cosa Nostra was simple in design and absolute in enforcement. Every member who earned money through any criminal enterprise was required to pay a percentage upward to his capo. The capo collected from his soldiers and associates and passed a percentage to the underboss and boss. The standard tribute rate, as described across multiple cooperating witness testimonies, was approximately 10% of gross earnings, though the exact figure varied by family and era. The system functioned identically to a franchise royalty. The family provided the brand, the protection, the dispute resolution mechanism, and the territorial authority that allowed the member to operate. In exchange, the member paid for the privilege. Failure to pay was not treated as a financial dispute. It was treated as an act of disrespect to the boss, and by extension to the family itself. The consequences ranged from loss of the earning operation to physical punishment to, in extreme cases, death. Sammy Gravano testified that the tribute system was the most consistently enforced economic rule in the Gambino family during his tenure. Men could be late, they could negotiate context, they could not refuse. The system also created a structural incentive for violence. If a soldier controlled a lucrative gambling operation and a rival operation opened on adjacent territory, the soldier's obligation to his capo meant that the threat was not merely personal, it was institutional. A loss of revenue affected everyone above him in the chain. That made the organizational response to competitive threats swift and disproportionate. 7. No member could speak to law enforcement under any circumstances. Omertà was not a tradition, it was a contract. The code of silence known as omertà is often described in popular accounts of organized crime as a cultural tradition rooted in Sicilian peasant society, a folkway carried to America by immigrants and maintained by custom. That description is insufficient. Within Cosa Nostra, omertà was an operational requirement enforced by execution. The rule was comprehensive. A made man could not speak to police, federal agents, prosecutors, grand juries, or any representative of law enforcement about any matter related to the organization, its members, or its activities. He could not confirm his own membership. He could not confirm the membership of others. He could not acknowledge the existence of the organization itself. The prohibition extended beyond criminal matters. If a made member was the victim of a crime, a robbery, an assault, even an attempted murder, he was not permitted to report it to authorities. The matter was to be handled internally. If it could not be handled internally, it was to be absorbed. Gravano described the rule in absolute terms. There was no exception. There was no emergency provision. There was no circumstance under which cooperation with law enforcement was acceptable. The penalty was death, and the penalty was applied retroactively. If a member was discovered to have spoken to a federal agent 10 years prior, the passage of time did not mitigate the offense. The rule persisted because its enforcement was visible. Men who broke omertà were killed, and their deaths were communicated through the organization as demonstrations. The message was not subtle. Silence was the price of membership. Silence was permanent. 8. A member could not have a relationship with another member's wife. The violation was capital. Sexual conduct within Cosa Nostra was governed by a rule that was both specific in its prohibition and unforgiving in its enforcement. A made member was forbidden from pursuing, engaging in, or maintaining a romantic or sexual relationship with the wife, the girlfriend, or the daughter of another made member. The rule did not distinguish between consensual and non-consensual contact. It did not account for circumstances in which the other member's marriage had ended or the relationship had dissolved. The prohibition was categorical. The penalty was death for the offending member, and in some documented cases, for the woman involved as well. The rule served a function beyond sexual morality. Sexual jealousy, across every human organization in recorded history, has generated irrational violence. Within an organization already structured around the commission of violence, a sexual betrayal between members had the capacity to generate feuds that could consume entire crews, set capos against one another, and destabilize families for years. The rule eliminated the ambiguity. There was no conversation to be had. There was no mediation. The line was bright, and the consequence was final. Multiple cooperating witnesses described cases in which this rule was enforced with no deliberation. The discovery of the relationship was sufficient. The authorization for the killing was immediate. 9. A made man was required to come when called. No excuse was accepted. When a boss, underboss, or capo summoned a member, that member was required to appear, not when convenient, not when his schedule permitted, immediately or as close to immediately as physical distance allowed. The rule had no formal exceptions for illness, family obligation, or personal emergency. The summons carried an implicit weight that every member understood. Refusing to appear or appearing late without a reason the administration deemed sufficient was interpreted as an act of defiance. In an organization where hierarchy was maintained through demonstrated obedience, a failure to appear when summoned was not a logistical inconvenience. It was a signal. It suggested that the member placed his own judgment above the authority of the men who ran the family. That signal, left uncorrected, could erode the entire chain of command. The case of Louis de Bono illustrated the consequences of failing to answer. De Bono, a Gambino family member, repeatedly failed to appear when John Gotti summoned him in 1990. The reasons for his avoidance were widely understood. He suspected Gotti intended to kill him. His suspicion was correct. On October 4, 1990, De Bono was found shot to death in the parking garage of the World Trade Center. At trial, prosecutors established that Gotti had ordered the killing specifically because De Bono had not answered the call. The rule was enforced not because punctuality was a value the organization prized for its own sake. It was enforced because a man who would not come when called was a man the organization could not control, and a man the organization could not control was a man the organization could not afford to leave alive. 10. No member was permitted to keep written records of family business. Cosa Nostra operated for decades on a principle that most modern organizations would consider impossible. Nothing was to be written down. No minutes of meetings, no lists of members, no records of payments, debts, or decisions. The prohibition against written documentation was not a preference or a guideline. It was a rule communicated to every member and enforced through the same system that enforced every other rule, through consequences severe enough to ensure compliance. The logic was straightforward. Written records could be seized. A ledger recovered in a raid could map an entire crew's operations. A list of names found in a safe could confirm membership that the government had spent years trying to prove. A single piece of paper, in the wrong hands, could generate indictments that no amount of omertà could prevent. The irony, as federal investigators discovered repeatedly from the 1980s onward, was that the rule was broken almost as frequently as the narcotics prohibition. The family's own financial complexity made it nearly impossible to manage earnings, tribute payments, loan sharking operations, and gambling books without some form of documentation. Crews kept coded ledgers. Capos maintained records using nicknames and abbreviations. Bosses who publicly insisted on the rule privately tolerated its violation because the alternative was financial disorder that would cost them money. When raids did recover written records, the results were devastating. Coded or not, the documents gave prosecutors a structural map they could present to juries. A ledger that read 500 from C on Tuesday might not identify a specific individual on its own. Combined with surveillance, wiretaps, and cooperating witness testimony, it became a piece in a puzzle that convicted entire hierarchies. The rule against written records was sound in theory. In practice, the organizations that followed it most rigorously were the ones law enforcement found hardest to penetrate. The organizations that tolerated exceptions paid for every one of them. 11. A member could not introduce himself as a member. A third party had to vouch. The identification system within Cosa Nostra was designed to solve a problem that any secret organization with hundreds of members across multiple cities inevitably faces. How do two men, who have never met confirm that they belong to the same organization without exposing themselves to an outsider or an undercover agent? The answer was a protocol so specific that its consistency across decades and geographies confirmed, more than almost any other single detail, that Cosa Nostra operated as a unified national entity rather than a collection of loosely affiliated local gangs. A made member could never identify himself as such to another made member. A third member, someone who personally knew both men and could confirm both of their statuses, was required to make the introduction. The language was precise. The introducing member would say of the man being presented, "This is a friend of ours." That phrase, and only that phrase, confirmed made status. The phrase, "a friend of mine," indicated an associate, someone connected to the organization but not initiated. The distinction was operational, not social. A friend of ours could be trusted with information about family business. A friend of mine could not. The protocol meant that any man who approached a member and announced his own membership was immediately suspect. Either he did not understand the rules, which meant he was not a member, or he was law enforcement attempting to establish a false identity. Joseph Pistone, the FBI agent who infiltrated the Bonanno family as Donnie Brasco for 6 years, was introduced through this system repeatedly. Each introduction was conducted by Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, who vouched for Pistone personally. When Pistone's identity was revealed, Ruggiero's failure to detect the deception cost him his standing and ultimately contributed to his imprisonment. Dominic Napolitano, who had also vouched for Brasco at higher levels, was murdered by the family for the same failure. The introduction protocol was not merely a formality. It was a security system whose consequences for failure were absolute. 12. Members were prohibited from striking, assaulting, or disrespecting a boss under any provocation. The authority of the boss within a Cosa Nostra family was, by internal design, total. A soldier or capo could disagree with a decision. He could, through careful and private channels, communicate that disagreement to his immediate superior. What he could not do, under any circumstance, was express that disagreement through disrespect, confrontation, or physical aggression directed at the boss. The rule was not limited to violence. A raised voice in the presence of the boss, a dismissive gesture observed by other members, a comment made to a third party that called the boss's judgment into question. Any of these could be interpreted as a violation, and the interpretation rested entirely with the boss himself and his administration. The practical effect was that internal dissent within a family had no legitimate outlet. A soldier who believed his boss was making decisions that endangered the organization had two options. He could remain silent and comply, or he could conspire to replace the boss through an authorized action approved by the commission, a process that required the support of a majority of the other family bosses, and that, if it failed, guaranteed his death. The rule produced stability at the cost of adaptability. Families led by competent bosses thrived under the structure because discipline was maintained without friction. Families led by incompetent or paranoid bosses suffered because the membership had no mechanism to correct course, short of a palace coup that most men were unwilling to risk. Paul Castellano's leadership of the Gambino family in the early 1980s illustrated both sides. His authority was unchallenged in formal terms. His decisions regarding the family's direction, including his prohibition on narcotics and his increasingly corporate management style, generated widespread dissatisfaction among the capos and soldiers who earned their income from street-level operations. No one confronted him. No one raised the issue publicly. John Gotti simply organized an assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse and replaced him. The rule against disrespecting the boss had not prevented the conflict. It had merely ensured that the conflict, when it came, would be lethal rather than deliberative. 13. A member could not refuse an order from his boss, even if the order was to commit murder. The oath taken during initiation was not ceremonial language. It was a binding operational commitment whose terms were tested in many cases within months of a member's induction. When a boss, acting through his underboss or a capo, issued an order, compliance was mandatory. The member was not permitted to negotiate the terms, question the reasoning, or request a delay. He was expected to execute the order as described and report its completion. This applied to all orders, but its most consequential application was in the commission of murder. A soldier ordered to kill another individual, whether a rival, a witness, or a fellow member who had been marked for execution, was not being asked. He was being told. Refusal was itself a violation of sufficient gravity to warrant the same consequence being applied to the man who refused. Sammy Gravano described this dynamic in his testimony with a clarity that prosecutors used repeatedly in subsequent trials. He had not wanted to participate in several of the 19 murders he admitted to. His reluctance was irrelevant. The order had come from John Gotti, who had received received authorization from the relevant channels. Gravano's function was to carry it out. His feelings about it were, in the framework of the organization, not a relevant consideration. The rule created an enforcement mechanism of extraordinary efficiency. The boss did not need to maintain a dedicated team of killers, though many did. Every member of the family was, by the terms of his oath, available to commit violence when directed. This distributed the operational burden and made it significantly harder for law enforcement to predict who would carry out a specific act. The man who pulled the trigger might have no prior relationship with the victim and no personal motive. He was simply the member who received the assignment. 14. No member could operate in another family's territory without explicit permission. Cosa Nostra's geographic organization was not approximate. It was specific, negotiated, and enforced through the commission with the same rigor applied to any other rule. Each family controlled defined territories within which its members were authorized to conduct criminal operations. The boundaries were understood by every member and respected not out of courtesy, but out of the knowledge that a territorial violation was treated as an act of aggression against the family that controlled the area. A Gambino soldier could not open a gambling operation in Genovese territory. A Lucchese crew could not run a loan sharking book in a neighborhood controlled by the Colombo family. If a member identified an earning opportunity outside his family's jurisdiction, the protocol required him to bring the matter to his capo, who would raise it with the administration, who would then negotiate access with the family that controlled the territory in question. That negotiation typically involved a revenue-sharing arrangement. The requesting family would receive permission to operate in exchange for a percentage of earnings flowing to the host family. The system prevented the kind of territorial wars that had decimated organized crime in the 1920s and early 1930s, before Lucky Luciano's establishment of the Commission in 1931. The Commission existed, at its most fundamental level, to resolve exactly these kinds of disputes through negotiation rather than violence. When the system worked, it produced decades of relative stability, during which all 5 families earned simultaneously without significant armed conflict. When it broke down, typically because a boss had become too aggressive or too erratic, the consequences were measured in bodies. 15. All murders of made men required commission approval. The internal regulation of violence within Cosa Nostra reached its most formal expression in the requirement that any killing of a made member be approved by the commission before it was carried out. This was not a guideline. It was the single most important structural rule in the organization's governance, and its enforcement was the primary function of the commission itself. The process was deliberate. The family seeking authorization would present its case to the commission, typically through the boss or acting boss. The justification had to be substantive. The target had been cooperating with law enforcement. The target had committed an unauthorized murder. The target had stolen from the family. The target had violated the narcotics rule in a manner that endangered the broader organization. The commission would evaluate the request, consider whether the killing would generate unacceptable law enforcement attention, and either approve or deny. If denied, the requesting family was bound by the decision. Proceeding without authorization was itself a violation that could result in the death of the men who ordered and carried out the unsanctioned killing. The rule existed because the consequences of an unauthorized murder of a made man were potentially catastrophic for the entire organization. If a Gambino soldier killed a Genovese capo without commission approval, the act could trigger an interfamily war that would consume resources, generate bodies, attract federal attention, and weaken every family simultaneously. The commission approval process ensured that such killings were strategic rather than impulsive, and that the broader organization had assessed the cost before the price was paid. The Castellano assassination in December 1985 was a violation of this rule. John Gotti did not seek or receive commission approval. He acted unilaterally, built support among sympathetic capos within the Gambino family, and executed the hit outside Sparks Steakhouse. The commission did not retaliate, in part because Gotti moved quickly to consolidate power, and in part because several commission members had their own grievances with Castellano. But the precedent was noted. The rule had been broken, and the man who broke it had been rewarded with leadership. That was a crack in the foundation that the organization never fully repaired. 16. A member was not permitted to discuss family business with non-members, including his own wife. The compartmentalization of information within Cosa Nostra extended beyond the prohibition against speaking to law enforcement. It governed every interaction a member had with every person outside the organization. A made man was not permitted to discuss the existence of the family, its membership, its operations, its internal disputes, or its rules with anyone who was not himself a made member. This included associates who worked with the family but had not been formally inducted. It included lifelong friends. It included explicitly the member's own wife and children. So, the rule was communicated during the initiation ceremony and reinforced through a culture of deliberate silence that members were expected to maintain in all contexts outside of authorized conversations with fellow members. The practical enforcement was imperfect. Men talked to their wives. They spoke in general terms to associates. They occasionally disclosed more than they should have to people they trusted. The organization understood this. What it enforced was not perfect silence, but a standard of discretion that, when violated at scale, triggered consequences. A member who boasted openly about family business in front of non-members was creating a security risk that the organization treated with the same seriousness as direct cooperation with law enforcement. The case against John Gotti was built in significant part on exactly this kind of violation. Gotti spoke freely about family operations within the Ravenite Social Club, where the FBI had installed listening devices. He discussed murders, identified members, criticized associates by name, and laid out the structure of his operations with a candor that suggested he had either forgotten the rule or believed it did not apply to him. The 600 hours of recordings captured at the Ravenite provided the evidentiary foundation for the prosecution that convicted him in 1992. The rule against discussing family business existed because of men like Gotti. Its violation destroyed him and damaged the Gambino family for a generation. 17. A member could not commit robbery against another member or his operations. Theft within Cosa Nostra was governed by a simple principle. You did not steal from your own. The rule applied to all forms of appropriation, from the theft of physical property to the skimming of revenue from a joint operation to the diversion of tribute payments that should have flowed upward through the hierarchy. The prohibition covered every member of every family. A Gambino soldier could not rob a Colombo bookmaker. A Lucchese associate could not burglarize the home of a Bonanno capo. The rule extended to the operations themselves. If a crew ran a loan sharking book, the proceeds were divided according to the agreed structure. A member who took more than his share was not engaged in a financial disagreement. He was committing an offense that the organization treated as a fundamental breach of trust, though the consequences were proportional to the scale and the target. Stealing from a fellow soldier might result in a beating and financial restitution, depending on the capo's judgment. Stealing from a capo was significantly more dangerous. Stealing from the boss was a death sentence in virtually every documented case. Tony Accardo's response to the 1977 burglary of his home, in which 6 members of the crew responsible were killed within months, was not considered disproportionate within the organization's framework. The burglars had violated the home of the boss. The response was the response the rules prescribed. What made the prohibition effective was not its moral weight, but its structural function. The organization's earning capacity depended on members being able to operate without fear of predation from within. A loan shark could not function if his collections were subject to theft by fellow members. A gambling operation could not generate consistent revenue if its proceeds were diverted before reaching the men who had authorized it. The rule against internal theft was the economic foundation on which every other activity rested. 18. A member under indictment was expected to bear his sentence in silence, and the family was obligated to support his dependents. The relationship between a Cosa Nostra family and its imprisoned members was governed by a reciprocal obligation that functioned as the organization's most important retention mechanism. When a member was arrested, indicted, and convicted, he was expected to maintain absolute silence. He was not to cooperate with prosecutors, not to testify before grand juries, not to provide information of any kind in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was to serve his time, however long, without implicating any member of any family. In return, the family was obligated to provide financial support to the imprisoned member's wife and children for the duration of his sentence. Monthly payments were made through intermediaries. The amounts varied by family and by the member's rank, but the obligation was not optional. A boss who failed to support the families of imprisoned members was violating a compact that every member understood as the central bargain of membership. The system worked for decades because both sides of the obligation were enforced through the same mechanism of social pressure and violent consequence that governed every other rule. A member who cooperated faced death upon release, or, in some cases, the targeting of his associates. A boss who failed to provide support faced the erosion of loyalty that would eventually produce the very cooperation he sought to prevent. The system began to collapse in the 1980s and 1990s as federal sentences grew longer and the financial burden on families increased. Members facing 20, 30, or 40 years under RICO and mandatory minimum statutes found the bargain increasingly difficult to honor, particularly when the promised support for their families arrived late, arrived short, or did not arrive at all. Gravano testified that one of the factors in his decision to cooperate was the growing sense that the obligations the organization owed its members were no longer being met with the consistency the rules demanded. The compact had been the glue. When the glue weakened, the structure came apart. 19. A made man could never involve law enforcement to resolve a personal dispute, even outside of family business. The prohibition against contact with law enforcement extended beyond the operational concerns of omerta into the most routine aspects of a member's daily life. A made man who was involved in an automobile accident could not file a police report that might lead to questions about his identity, his income, or his associations. A member whose home was burglarized could not call the police. A member involved in a dispute with a neighbor, a landlord, or a business partner outside of the organization's criminal activities could not seek legal remedies that required police involvement. The rule was absolute in its articulation and broadly, though not perfectly, observed in practice. Its logic was defensive. Every interaction with law enforcement, no matter how routine, created a record. A police report generated a name, an address, a description of assets, and potentially a set of questions that could lead to further inquiry. A court appearance for a civil matter might place a member in a public database, connect him to an address that investigators had not previously identified, or expose financial details that contradicted his reported income. The cumulative effect of these seemingly minor contacts could, over time, build the kind of documentary trail that federal investigators use to construct RICO cases. The rule also reinforced the organization's internal authority. If members resolved their personal disputes through external institutions, the family's role as the ultimate arbiter of conflict was diminished. The boss's authority rested in part on his function as a mediator and judge within the community the family controlled. A member who bypassed that authority by seeking redress through the courts was undermining the structural foundation of the boss's power, whether he intended to or not. 20. The rules themselves were never to be discussed with anyone outside the organization. Their existence was the final secret. Every rule described in this video, from the initiation ceremony to the tribute system to the commission's authority over the killing of made men, operated under a meta rule that governed all the others. The rules themselves were secret. A made member was not permitted to describe the organization's internal governance to any person who was not a member. He could not explain the initiation process to his wife. He could not describe the commission's function to an associate who had not been inducted. He could not discuss the code of omerta in terms that acknowledged it as a formal requirement rather than a cultural preference. The rules existed in an oral tradition maintained exclusively by the men who had sworn to uphold them, and who understood that the disclosure of the system itself was as grave a violation as the disclosure of any specific criminal act. This is the reason the rules remained unknown to law enforcement for as long as they did. It was not that agents and prosecutors lacked intelligence or resources. It was that the organization had built a second layer of secrecy around its governance that made the first layer, the silence about specific crimes, almost impenetrable. You could not investigate a system you did not know existed. You could not charge a conspiracy whose rules you could not describe. When Joseph Valachi testified in 1963, the significance of his testimony was not primarily the specific crimes he described. It was that he explained how the organization worked. He described the initiation. He named the families. He drew the hierarchy. He told the United States Senate and a national television audience that a formal, structured, rule-governed secret society had been operating inside the country for decades. The rules had been kept secret for the better part of a century. Once they were spoken aloud, the organization never fully recovered from the exposure. Every subsequent prosecution, from the commission trial in 1986 to the Gotti conviction in 1992, was built on the structural understanding that Valachi had been the first to provide. The final secret of Cosa Nostra was not any single crime. It was the system itself. And once the system was visible, the men who had built it could no longer hide inside it.